A former detransitioner rails against TERFs for exploiting him. Toby Pick spoke out at an anti-trans event and was part of a movement that led to a case stopping prescription of puberty blockers to youth just 3 years ago. Now at 23, he's a proudly out, non-binary trans man who has turned his focus against the TERF groups that he says exploited him. He cites anger with his experience with the medical system in the UK and an overall lack of understanding and listening to him that led to his disillusionment with the whole experience and eventually put him in league with major TERF groups. My whole experience of my transition and detransition had the TERFy lens on it before I had even had a chance to separate any of my own feelings, Toby said. He first began to question his gender at age 10 in 2016 and came out to his parents as a trans and non-binary man later that year. He says that he fell in what he now describes as anti-trans hate groups after he failed to get the treatment he needed from the Nottingham Center for Transgender Health in 2017. By 2019, still without sufficient treatment, Toby identified publicly as a lesbian before getting wrapped up in the whole TERF movement. He describes how he fell into that negative loop by stating, "When I started out, I didn't have any opinion of trans. Then it sort of got into this. Once you get into it, it gets more extreme. I was angry at the gender identity clinic, and I was angry at trans everything. I had anger in me, so it made sense when I'm talking to these people, the gender critics, saying these things, and they are validating that it's horrible," he said. All of this negativity in him building from the fact that the trans healthcare system at the time had little understanding of or support for people identifying as non-binary. Now that he is out of the spotlight and beyond all of the negative rhetoric, however, he is rejoicing in the success of his recent top surgery and looking forward to starting testosterone. But all that comes after hard work to, quote, undo a lot of fear, unquote, instilled in him by the toxic anti-trans groups that used him as a mouthpiece in that vulnerable time. Toby now says he's in a great place with an identity that's still a work in progress despite the difficulties inherent in that journey. I sort of downplayed how hard being trans was. You've got a life of constantly having to prove yourself or more, justify and explain yourself. We've talked here on the show quite a bit about detransitioners, and a common thread with them is usually that they have some sort of neurodiversity, which is misdiagnosed and interpreted as gender dysphoria. And then once you've got that diagnosis, you're sort of ushered, some might say pushed down that road towards hormones and some of the surgeries. And, it's a confusing time for a lot of people. And some people just kind of go along with it. It sounds like the right thing and they go with it. And then they find out later that it wasn't correct for them. And so then they go on this massive crusade as detransitioners against transgender care for people that need it, for people who actually are trans. And as I say a lot of times on this show, it's really important for us to suss out the vast differences in those cases and make sure that what we're adjusting is our diagnosis and how we look at, diagnosing trans people, to make sure that people who aren't trans don't get swept up in that, and that there's that constant follow-up and that avenue for people to identify as non-binary, to not go down medical transition routes, to test out their new identity and stuff like that before moving on to these things. I say over and over again, it's a diagnosis problem, not a care problem. The care is sound, the care is proven to help, but it's just a matter of who we get in there and what we do. And again, to reiterate something we've covered lots of times, detransitioners are a very small fraction of the population. So, we show that it's a small percentage of people who stop transition or detransition, and a great majority of those, I believe it's 60 some odd percent. I'll have to check my numbers on that, but a great percentage of the people who stop transition or detransition do so because of social or familial pressures, not because they're not trans. But there are those in that number, in that detransition number, that are not trans. And they need to be cared for. They need to be looked at. They need to be listened to. But we need to make sure we don't turn them into ways of trying to prove that the whole transgender thing is invalid, because it's incredibly valid, and they're a very small percentage of people that are wrapped up in it. Their case, what they go through, is very traumatic, and like I said, needs to be listened to. They need to be heard, they need to be validated, but we need to stop people using them as fodder against us, because again, there's a great deal of good, solid proof and evidence that transgender care helps youth and adults significantly, and we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater in that. But this is a great story of somebody who identified as a detransitioner, was caught in the TERF anti-trans movement, was used for that, was proved very helpful for them in that as a talking point and as a mouthpiece, but as now on the other side of it, has gotten away from that anger, has gotten to see clearly their identity, who they are, and the truth of the whole situation. And it sounds like it's finally gotten some good, genuine care that they need. And now they're living their best life, despite the issues with being trans. Because as he points out, as we like to remind everybody, being trans is no cakewalk. It's not a super fun thing. It's just good when you find out that you're trans and accept it and learn to love yourself. That's the part about being trans that's good.